Resuming debate, the honourable member for Prince Albert.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to join my colleagues supporting support of marketing choice for Western Canadian grain farmers. The move to marketing freedom is exciting for all Saskatchewan farmers, especially Saskatchewan durum growers, who produce close to 80% of Canada's durum. This will mean greater price transparency for farmers before spring seeding so they can make more informed decisions about spring planting. This will give farmers the flexibility to react quickly to market signals and take advantage of market pricing opportunities. The days of durum growers being forced to store their crop for 1 or 2 or 3 or more years are over. Or worse yet, when durum growers had high quality durum and they were forced to liquidate it on the feed market in order to make cash because the board would not sell that durum. That nightmare will be a thing of the past. There's no doubt this is all very good news for Saskatchewan producers. The wheat and barley business in Saskatchewan is a major driver of our economy, bringing almost $2 billion to the farm gate. Mr. Speaker, the sky's the limit, like the Minister said, on what the potential is once this legislation is through. $2 billion is a small number. $2 billion could be 4, 6, or 8 billion. When you look at where wheat was in the 30s, in the 40s, and then when you look at what happened when we brought in the single desk and how the processing system moved, how it all went to somewhere else, just think what can happen when now that can move back onto the prairies. Just think of how farmers can participate and partner and actually form their own cooperatives to mill their own durum and wheat and barley. I'm very confident can grow a business even more under marketing choice. And I must commend our Prime Minister, the Minister of Agriculture, the Parliamentary Secretary, and all my colleagues for all the hard work they've done on this file. You know, Conservative members have been out in the riding talking to farmers. We do that on a weekly basis when we go back on weekends. Our farmers have been very blunt. They said, move fast, make this happen. We need the freedom. We need it now. That is what's happening here today, and I commend the Minister and the Prime Minister for seeing this through and allowing farmers to eventually, or for finally, have that freedom to market their own grain. You know, one thing about marketing freedom that's going to be a benefit is the innovation that will come from it. You know, I worked in the agriculture sector before I was involved with farming and my career here in Ottawa, and I can remember the days of summer fallow. You know what? Farmers used to summer fall half and half. Then all of a sudden the farmer got this idea and says, why do I need the summer fall? Why don't I just seed into my stubble? All of a sudden direct seeding happened. Well, you know, there's a couple manufacturers out there called Burgo and Flexicoil and Morris that looked at that and said, these are farmer-owned businesses, by the way. This is great. Why don't we just direct seed into that? Why do we even need to work it at all? You know, if you look at the results of that innovation, farmers' costs have reduced substantially. Farmers' use of fuel reduced substantially. In fact, the tractor manufacturers were concerned because the hours they're putting on their tractors, instead of flipping tractors every 2 or 3 years, now they're going 5, 6, 7 years. That's the type of innovation that can happen on the prairies. And that's the type of innovation farmers will have to put into wheat and barley. But let's also talk about innovation that we've seen in non-bird crops. Let's look about value-added processing. You know, one crop that my colleague from Manitoba talked about was oats. Here's a crop that was under the single desk. Here's a crop that under the single desk nobody would grow. Here's a crop under the single desk that couldn't get more than 80 cents a bushel. The board released oats out of the single desk. A year later, price per bushel goes up. A year later, I see farmers growing oats. And I talk to my neighbors and I say, you're growing oats, how come? He says, it's paying the bills. So he's actually substituting oats for wheat. And I said, well, why are you doing that? Because it's paying the bills. In fact, if you talk to farmers and ask what paid the bills over the last 10 or 15 years, he's not going to say wheat. He's not going to say barley. He's going to say canola, pulses, and oats. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? Why is those crops paying the bills? Well, the other interesting thing, we hear this argument about you can't process grains in the prairie because it's too far from market. Well, let's look at the canola sector. Let's look at Yorkton, 2 mills, processing plants in Yorkton. Let's look at Lloydminster, another canola plant in Lloydminster. Let's look at Clavet, Saskatchewan, a small town outside of Saskatoon, another processing plant for canola. Canola is now almost $6 billion to the Canadian economy. Canola wasn't a big crop in the 70s. This all happened in the last 30 years. Why didn't wheat grow at that same level? Why didn't that innovation for wheat happen? We have to look and examine and ask those questions. We can't put our head in the sand. And one of the results of that question is the regulatory, or the CWB, and their process in not making changes, in not exploring new opportunities, unwilling to allow value added to happen in prairies. You know, I think back to the days of the Weyburn Inland Terminal. You know, the Weyburn Inland Terminal is a very, very progressive group of farmers. They built the first terminal on the prairies. They introduced the concept of direct hit trains to the west coast. They introduced the concept of cleaning the grain on the prairies so the dockage can be fed to cows, and the clean grain actually goes to the coast without having to pay the cleaning charges out in the west coast. Well, these guys, they thought, you know what? There's a durum plant across the line in North Dakota. We can do that here in Weyburn. And they went together, they raised the money, they had the business plan, they had the market, they had it all developed. And then this thing called the CWB came up and said, no, absolutely not. You're not going to do this. This is not allowed. This is not under the Act. And the minister from Wascana, instead of backing farmers, what did he do? He backed the board. Well, farmers were irate. You know, that might have been the straw that broke the camel's back on this file. When you looked at farmers saying told no, that they can't value add and process their own products. Not only that, it was very interesting. When I used to travel with Flexco, I was down in Milk River, and I had a dealer right on the border. Milk River's right on the Montana line. And every once in a while, we'd sneak across the line and talk to some farmers down there with the salesman I knew down there. And I was talking to this one barley grower, and I said, you grow a lot of barley. Why do you grow so much barley? Because, you know, there's no money in barley in Canada. And he says, oh, you wouldn't believe this. The guys from Coors came out to my farm 2 years ago. They said to me, if you grow this type of barley, we'll supply the seed. If you'll work with us and our agronomists to make sure that we get the proper quality, we'll give you a price that you can't say no to. And that's what they did. All of a sudden, the farmers around Milk River on the American side were growing a pile of barley. They were selling it to Coors, making a premium, making a good profit. The company was happy. The farmer was happy. Here's an example of partnerships that can work. Coors tried to do this on the Canadian side because our Canadian, Canadian farmers there said, hey, this is a good deal. Why can't we do that? Who said no? Canadian Wheat Board. The Canadian Wheat Board was unable or unwilling to accommodate Coors. And actually, when you look at the location of malt plants that were built over the last few years, they're not in Canada. They're in Montana. When you look at the location of durum plants, up till now, the biggest durum plant was actually in downtown Winnipeg at Seagee. Did that make sense? Canadian durum. We ship durum all over the world, and the only processing plant in the West is in downtown Winnipeg? Again, you have to ask why that is. There has to be a reason why that value added and that processing is not happening on the prairies. And again, when you do a process of elimination, you can see why that is. It's because the board at that point in time wanted to export grain. They didn't want to see processed grain. And that's what their mandate was, and that's what they were going to do. And if that meant farmers couldn't participate in the value add chain, well, so be it. You're not participating in that chain. You know, it's funny. The board will come up and say, well, Mr. Farmer, if you want to just to export your grain, we can do that. We'll give you a buyback. We'll let you sell the grain to the board, and then we'll charge you a premium to buy it back. And then you can do what you want with it. Well, that sounds really good. You think, okay, well, that's fair. So buy it back. I can look at the U.S. market, or if I want to ship some barley to Hong Kong or China, I can do that. But then when you look at what they wanted to charge you on the buyback, it made it so it's next to impossible for you to ever make any money. Yet when you got your final payment from the Canadian Wheat Board, it was never close to the buyback. Where did that money go? You know, farmers would sit there and shake their head and say, well, you say I have opportunity under this system to do that, but really you don't. Practicality, it's not possible. So again, here's another system. Instead of telling farmers yes, instead of working with farmers to help them develop these niche markets, their answer was no, absolutely not. You know, I had a farmer actually talk to a wheat board rep in the early or the late 90s, and this rep was giving him he was giving the rep a little hard time about this Coors barley, which I talked about before, and the rep proceeded to tell him that wheat and barley does not belong to him once he harvests it. So think about this. Like, just go through the process again. So in the spring, you know, he's going to plant as many canola acres as he can because that's his cash crop. He's going to plant as many pulse and peas acres as he can because that's his cash crop. But he has to do a rotational crop. And for my members that don't farm, a rotational crop is a filler crop so that they can actually change the type of variety of chemical they use so that they don't see weed tolerance build up and they can actually reduce the weeds that are on the prairies or in their fields. So it's not something that they want to do, it's something that they have to do as they farm. So then they bring in wheat and in a later case barley. They do that as their rotational crop. So fall comes on, they're harvesting their wheat, got a beautiful crop of durum, beautiful crop of wheat. They got a nice crop of canola, nice crop of pulses. They got to pay some bills because every fall, farmers take out a little bit of cash advance, so they got to haul some grain off that combine and pay those bills. Well, wait a minute, I want to haul my wheat. No contract. You cannot haul that wheat right now. What? I need cash flow. How do I get cash flow? Maximize your cash advance if you need cash flow. Well, I don't want to do that. Don't care. That's not our problem. You cannot haul that wheat or barley. So what do? They sell their pulses and they sell their canola. And what does the trade do? Well, they can't take all that grain at the same time, so the basis goes up. So the actual price the farmer gets off the combine gets reduced because the board is unwilling to move that grain at that point in time. Again, does this have the best farmer's interest at heart? It does not. It never has. It was a system made for the 1940s and 1950s. And like my colleague said before, this system didn't come into play because farmers wanted it. This system came into play because farmers participated and helped in the war effort. Then it was forced upon them. And when farmers wanted out of it, they weren't able to get out of it. Liberal governments realized this thing was a nice cash flow for them. It was a nice cash flow for their buddies. Let's look at the Liberal ties into the Canadian Wheat Board. Let's look at the people who are working there. Let's look at who's doing their survey or voter identification, because that's very important when you start talking about plebiscites. David Hurley sitting there doing their surveys every year, doing voter identification with his survey, identifying which farmers support the single desk and which ones don't. Where did that information go? I know farmers never got to see it. Farmers never got to see the file on them. You've got a plebiscite that you claim is supposed to be so accurate and so honest. Well, explain to me, there's 51,000 permit book holders, yet there's 61,000 ballots sent out. Who got the extra 10,000 ballots? Mr. Oberg, where did they go? Mr. Speaker, a friend of mine came up to me here 2 weeks ago and he said he was in Safeway and he's known to be a big farmer in the area and a fairly notable person. He said this lady came up that he really didn't know, but she came up to him, she pointed him in the chest and said, I want to talk to you about this plebiscite. And he says, I got a little defensive. I thought she was going to, really tie into me. She says, my brother and sister got a vote and they're both dead. How accurate of a plebiscite did they actually do if dead people are voting in it? And then what frustrates me more, I have farmers who are big farmers, who are aggressive and progressive farmers, who phoned me up and said, where's my ballot? I've been growing wheat for 20 years. Why didn't I get a ballot? And these are the same guys during the Wheat Board directors election saying the exact same thing. Why didn't I get a ballot? Why didn't I get to participate? When they look at that sham, when they look at how the Wheat Board treats them, do you think they'd ever trust the results of a Wheat Board plebiscite? Do you think they'd ever trust that? Not only that, when we look at this plebiscite, there's one question that they didn't ask. Did you want choice? Did you want to have the ability to use the board, or did you want to have the ability to sell outside the board? That was never in the question. It was either single desk or nothing. And this board of directors, they're like Thelma and Louise. They want to drive this thing off the cliff. If they can't get their way, they're going to just drive this car right off the cliff, come hell or come high water. And that's what's frustrating a lot of farmers out in the prairies these days. Because there is a lot of legitimate farmers who looked at it and said, hey, I want to sell my grain to the board. I like the idea of pooling. It spreads my risk. And that option is going to be there. That's why it's so confusing to listen to our opposition members, because the Wheat Board in their council, when they're handing out the teddy bears and when they're telling you that this is horrible things for Western Canada, they're actually talking about themselves. They're not talking about farmers. Reality is reality, and the reality is this organization has lost touch with farmers. It's lost touch with the producers that actually wanted to use them. This organization in the last 4 months, instead of going out and doing plebiscites, they could have aggressively been out securing acreages. They claim they have 22,000 supporters through this so-called plebiscite. If that's the case, Why don't you have 22,000 producers signing up acres today and tomorrow? You would know then how many tons of wheat and durum and barley you would have. And then the other thing I find really interesting is I've had some accredited exporters who represent the board in Africa and around the world, because we always talk about the board selling all this grain. Reality is they don't sell it. Accredited exporters take on that role and sell it in these countries. And I find it really interesting when they come to me in Ottawa and say, we can't source wheat after March. The board is telling us, you can't have it. We're not going to give it to you. Again, you've got 22,000 farmers over here. You've got an accredited exporter over here. CWB volunteer in the middle. They have a role to play to bring them together. But do you think they'll do that? No. Why? Philosophy. Again, it comes back to my Thelma and Louise analogy. They would rather prove us wrong and destroy the entity than actually try to make it work. And that's really disappointing, and that's really frustrating for me as a MP. Not only that, it's really frustrating for me as a farmer, because they've taken that tool that was in my toolbox, and instead of giving me a new tool that I can use, they've basically taken that tool and thrown it away. So our government, what did we do? We did what we had to do to represent all farmers. We're not destroying the CWB. We're basically just taking away the single desk. But there will be a CWB. If farmers so choose to use it, they will be able to use it. If farmers so choose to ship their grain through Churchill, they can ship it through Churchill. We're making sure that the assets, the rails and the ports are there for farmers to use. When it comes to producer cars, that's embedded under the Canadian Grain Act, not the Wheat Board Act. That's not changing. If you want to use a producer car, you phone up the CGC and you get a producer car. If a farmer wants to load his own rail car, he can do that. And he may want to do that. Again, those choices are not changing. But let's listen to what the CWB is saying. Again, spreading fear, spreading mistruths or half-truths, talking about, oh, we're all going to lose producer cars. That's not happening. Read the legislation. It's not there. Read the Canada Grain Act. You'll see it right then and there. That is not changing. Producer cars will be there. Now, we talk about Thunder Bay or Churchill. You know, my area wants to use Churchill. In fact, we're pretty excited because there's a rail line that's CN's owned for quite a while that they haven't allowed anybody to go down it, and it's coming up for abandonment, and local producers are talking about getting together and buying that line so that it'll actually go from Tisdale to Hudson Bay, then up to Churchill. They're excited about that. That's going to pull about $15 a ton off their freight. $15 a ton is roughly $15 an acre. An average farmer that maybe does 1,000 acres of wheat, that's $15,000 in his pocket, hard cash. Think about it. If it makes economic sense to use Churchill, they'll use Churchill. We're making sure that they have that option. We're making sure that Churchill is viable so that as the transition goes on, it doesn't get left out. And actually, I think as we see the rail improve and we see some of these farmer-owned cooperatives or rail lines moving grain into Churchill, it actually will get busier. So is this bad for Churchill? There's lots of potential for Churchill. You know, I come back to the canola sector and looking at and what we've seen happen there, and I touched on about the Favour, just under $6 billion it brings in. Thank you, Speaker. You know, I just look at the oat sector, and I can think back to Saskatoon. You know, if you go to the University of Saskatchewan, if you were to go there, again, 15 years ago, you had a Department of Agriculture, but that was about it. You go there now, well, first of all, you go to Martinsville, you can see an oat processing plant. Again, that didn't come into play until the single desk for oats was gone. You go around the University of Saskatchewan, they say, well, actually, if you want to see the research, you have to go outside. You'll see all these field-size research farms. Companies have located into Saskatoon and doing all this research work in canola. You know, I have a very good friend, Dr. Fowler, who's a very well-established, renowned plant breeder, and he's been in front of Ag Committee numerous times, and he expressed his frustrations in being a plant breeder. He expressed his frustrations in winter wheat, where he developed new varieties for Canadian farmers and then be told by the CWB, no. And then he would actually use that variety in North Dakota and Montana. It'd be the #1 variety in the States, and our farmers would not have access to it. Yet we'd pay for that research. You know, in closing, Mr. Speaker, I think there's some other people we need to rectify or honor. You know, the late Art Waldy, here's a farmer that just wanted choice. He just wanted freedom. And it's too bad he's not here today. He'd be celebrating that freedom and choice. But I think the 12 farmers that went to jail, you know, had handcuffs, they're celebrating today. When I think of Jim Chatney, who used to get kicked out of board meetings because he just wanted to present other options to the board, he's celebrating. When I think about how they threatened his family and to take away his farm because he offered them an option of something different or opposed the way they handled things with farmers, I just think, Jim, this is part of this is for you. In closing, Mr. Speaker, this is great legislation. I'd encourage the opposition members to actually understand what's actually going on here. If you understood, you would not be opposing this legislation. In fact, you'd get behind it, and you'd realize just how great this will be for Canadian farmers and Western Canadian farmers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague, the member for Calgary Centre, says that he has no confidence in the consultations that were carried out. However, this was based on several some testifying and things that he's done in his writing. Now, my question is simple. Would my colleague be prepared to support a valid consultation being carried out, that objective studies being carried out on the consequences of doing away with the wheat board, and if not, why?
For Prince Albert.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I'll be sincere in my answer. I'll try not to politicalize it. There was a consultation. It's called a general election. In my writing, 70% of the farmers outside the city voted for me. And this is one of the things that they wanted to see done. In fact, last week I was back in my writing. I did some passport clinics. I never had one farmer, I shouldn't say that, I've had maybe 1 out of 500 farmers who came up to me and said, I don't necessarily like the changes. That's only 1 out of 500. When we start talking about the second part, it always is an issue when you look at moving forward. Our farmers are telling us we need to move forward fast and quickly. They cannot afford this single desk much longer, and that's why they're insisting we move forward as quick as we can.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saskatoon, Rosetown, Bigger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to thank my colleague from Saskatchewan for his remarks, for the incredible knowledge that he brings as a farmer from Saskatchewan to this file, and for the excellent work that he has done on the Ag Committee. My question is this. When the chair of the Canadian Wheat Board came down to Ottawa and bought the NDP caucus breakfast, it was reported that he requested that they delay the passage of this bill so that it would have a negative impact on the markets. And what I want to ask this member is if he would be willing to share his thoughts on this.
The Honourable Member for Prince Albert.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member from Saskatoon Rosetown. She's been a great member, and I know she was elected at the same time as me, and her knowledge on agriculture issues is greatly improving. I know she does a great job representing her farmers. You know, I always get a little concerned when I see CWB Board of Directors spending more time in Ottawa than they do out selling our grain. You know, they have another year to fulfill their contracts. They have till 2012 to actually finish selling this year's crop. And I'm concerned that they're spending all that time trying to disrupt the marketplace instead of making the transition so that farmers will reach the benefit of the grains that are grown. So I thank the member for her question. You know, as far as the existing board of directors and Mr. Oberg himself, you know what? They're going to do what they're going to do, I guess. But reality is they've quit working for farmers, and they're more concerned about keeping their own jobs. And that's what's going on.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Laval. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask my colleague from across the way, who very clearly expressed his point of view with a great deal of certainty in what he said, a great deal of self-assurance, and I'm wondering why the government has not held the plebiscite that is really within the legislation that created the Canadian Wheat Board. What has prevented the government from holding the plebiscite that should be held under the current legislation? Is it the fear of losing such a plebiscite? Or I don't know. Is it that from the outset that they didn't want to take that into account? Because we can't take action on such an important thing with impressions that people might have of a certain issue. So if he is doubting the quality of the consultations that were held, well, the government should then organize another one that they would consider as valid, and then they'll have the real answer.
Prince Albert.
Again, I thank the member for his question. I guess, first of all, I'm representing my farmers' point of view, not my point of view. And I speak on confidence because they've been fairly confident to me on what they want to see happen here in Ottawa. The other thing I'd point out is our farmers aren't waiting for you guys to learn and to get educated on this file. They want us to move forward. They don't feel that they should have to wait for opposition members who do not represent them in that area to get up to speed, nor should they have to pay for you to get up to speed. If you were actually to take some advice outside the Canadian Wheat Board, I don't think you would be taking the position you're taking. Every time you get up and defend the CWB, my numbers back in my writing go up another 2%. So, Mr. Speaker, there's two plebiscites here. There's a plebiscite on May 2nd that elected a Conservative majority that actually put all Conservative members in that area, and there'll be another plebiscite 4 years from now where when the farmers can actually review the job we've done.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for an excellent speech because he really talks about freedom and how this actually came about, how farmers were forced into forced collectivism about a government monopoly, that they were forced to do something that many of them had no choice. So we're talking about freedom here. And I've heard about the fear-mongering, the misrepresentation, and he mentions that many of his farmers actually do support a strong voluntary wheat board. And I was wondering, what does he think it is in the ideology of the Liberal Party and their comrades in the NDP that means they won't support freedom of choice and a strong voluntary wheat board? What does he think is in their ideology that would stop them from supporting choice?
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if it's ideology or just lack of knowledge on the issue. It could be one or the other. But I also want to point out, you know, under the Liberal government, this wheat board was in place, and there's been a lot of Liberal backroom members or participants who have benefited from a Canadian wheat board being in place. So maybe that's the reason behind it. Again, you look at David Hurley, you look at how they, it seemed like as they shipped grain to the East Coast, there's somebody there with their handout that somehow was tied to the Liberal Party, you know, whether it's Canada Steamship Lines or something else. So that might explain why the Liberals are really concerned about this file, because they actually have no representation in the prairies. So other than that, I guess that would be it. As far as the NDP, it's just strictly ideology. They just really can't understand that in an open market, in a free market, the economy grows, people move back into your province. You know, I come from Saskatchewan. You know, 4 years ago, we got a Sask Party government. 4 years ago, our towns were worried about how to pay for infrastructure because everybody was leaving. Now they're worried about paying for infrastructure because everybody's coming back. They need more commercial lots. They need more residential. That's the difference between socialism and letting the market do what the market should do.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Bourassa. I don't know if it's insurance or self-assurance rather, or arrogance, but I think you have to be careful not to look too high because you can fall in the end. I think it's rather interesting to mention Canada Steamship Lines within this argument. I don't understand the relationship, but I'm from Quebec, from Joliette, and I'm able to speak on behalf of all Canadians as well. So regardless of where people come from, it doesn't mean that they're unable to understand situations. It's not a monopoly. So what worries me is with this arrogance, this way of talking, Mr. Speaker, is that we're getting already into the next stage. And I think about the farmers in my riding who have dairy farms, and there the issue is going to be supply management. So is the member telling me that the next step is going to be taken against supply management?
The honourable member, excuse me, for Prince Albert.
Again, we're back to the fear and smear campaign of the Liberal Party. You know, they're trying to concern their farmers who are not going to be affected by this legislation. There's nothing in this legislation that talks about supply management. There's nothing that talks about dairy or eggs or poultry. Absolutely nothing. We've talked to those industries. They understand what's going on. Those industries are talking to farmers, and they understand why farmers want choice. You don't see them jumping up and down on this file. Reality, and when you talk about arrogance is when a minister puts farmers in jails and looks the other way. Arrogance is when you tell a farmer that he cannot own the crop he grows. Arrogance is when you tell a farmer, when he looks across the border in Montana and sees all his buddies prospering, that you can't have that same prosperity because we told you so. That's the arrogance of the Liberal government of the past. That's the arrogance of the CWB, and that's why it has to change.
Resuming debate. The honourable member for the BC Southern Interior.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to be in this full House once again, speaking on this topic. I wish to say that it gives me pleasure, but it does not give me pleasure.